This is Fintech Cappuccino, your Saturday morning podcast with a pinch of espresso on the why and how of fintech. The show is hosted by Brian van Wachem, CEO of RedSnap, and I'm Connie Dorrestein, founding partner of Bankify.
Hi, it's Connie.
Hi, Connie. With Brian.
Hi.
Hey, Connie, do you remember that in the previous podcast, Mark Buitek tipped us about an investigative reporter that wrote a book about kleptocracy called Moneyland?
Of course I do. I sort of scooped it up and read it in one fell swoop during the holiday.
Oh, yeah, me too. And I was stunned by it. And I was so stunned that I contacted the writer, Oliver Bullough, and invited him to the podcast. And guess what? He wants to join and tell us about his motivations to investigate financial crime and his book Moneyland. Would you like that?
Oh, of course I would. It was top of my wish list. That's superb news. And you know what, Brian? Whilst you've got a man on the phone, just check with him whether we can also talk about the current, Corona, COVID crisis time frame, whether, the rich are getting richer or whether they're suffering as well.
Sure. Let's go. I'll contact him and let's go for him. Yeah?
All right.
Speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Talk later. Bye.
This time is coming like a ghost town. All the clubs are being closed down.
Welcome, Oliver. Why did you choose this music?
Well, it was for Saturday morning, and it's nice to. Normally, I have a bit of a lie-in on a Saturday. The kids leave us alone and they play Minecraft, and then it's just nice to start the day with something a little bit upbeat to, get the blood moving while I make everyone a bit of breakfast. So I like ska music, and the specials are a particular favourite.
Hey, and what do you normally do on a Saturday morning?
Well, he just told us. Cook breakfast for the family.
Well, when I finish making breakfast for the boys, I don't know, I suppose I try and think of something which is a bit different to what we do every other day, which, considering that every other day we're stuck at home, it's a little bit hard, but, try and think of an interesting place to go or an interesting bit of the river to go and swim in or something. I mean, it's, life isn't very exciting right now.
Oliver Bullough studied modern history at Oxford University before moving to Russia, where he lived for over 7 years. Writing for local newspapers and then for Reuters news agency, he reported from Russia, Georgia, Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan. Oliver wrote 3 books so far. First one was Let Our Fame Be Great, a travel and history book which described his journey to find the scattered peoples of the mountains. It was shortlisted for the Ober Prize in the UK and won the Cornelius Ryan Award in the US. His second book, The Last Man in Russia, was published to brilliant reviews in 2013. And today we're going to talk to him about his latest book, which was published in 2018, called Moneyland, in which we join the investigative journalist Oliver Bullough on a journey into Moneyland, the secret country of the lawless, stateless, super rich. Oliver lives in Wales with his wife and son.
Oliver, you're way too interesting to waste our time on chit-chatting. Let's dive immediately into the subject. We all read about financial crime in the newspapers. The robbery of the Malaysian pension fund 1MDB by the Prime Minister was a major one, and Isabel dos Santos from Angola another. Not to mention the money laundering scandals at Standard Chartered, Wachovia and most recently Danske Bank. All big scandals that were eventually discovered and made public. Now, in your opinion, as an investigative reporter, what was or is the most notorious or shady money laundering or financial crime you discovered in the last decade?
I have a particular interest in financial crimes with a kind of slight comedy aspect because it makes it easy for me to tell the story. I find telling stories that are just very depressing is a little bit difficult to interest people in. So I suppose the one which I remain most proud of is a story about a house in London on Harley Street, which is a street in London that is very famous for top-end healthcare, that was being used as a base for shell companies involved in the most astonishing array of frauds. I mean, so many frauds that I had a 4,000-word article. I didn't even have room to scratch the surface with the sheer volume of frauds. I came across it first because it was the address where the president of Ukraine chose to keep his shell companies. But on top of that, there were, just everything, VAT fraud, various tax frauds, confidence trick, just money laundering, everything. So I suppose that's the one that I'm the proudest of. And it was also one of the first, big corruption investigations I did. And I suppose I still believed that I might change something by exposing money laundering. When actually it didn't make any difference at all. Nothing changed. In fact, weirdly, another journalist did a very similar investigation last year on the similar topic, covering the same ground, and nothing has changed again. So it was when I was a little bit more naive, and I didn't realise that actually no one really cares.
Yeah. You moved to Russia when you studied at Oxford. I was intrigued by that. What made you move there? Was it like just for study purposes, or were you already interested in sort of the complex ties between countries, money streams, etc.?
No, I wish I was. No, I'd always been interested in Russia. I think partly because I was a big fan of Tintin as a child, and he was always having interesting adventures in Eastern Europe. And also partly because when I was a teenager, Russia just seemed to have the most interesting politics and history. There was always stuff going on. So I was obsessed by Russia in general. I'm a boy from mid Wales, where not very much seems to happen. And I really like the idea of going somewhere where a lot happens. So no, I just moved to Russia in the late 1990s. Not for any particular glorious goal. I had a very good ska music scene, so I enjoyed that. And then I became a journalist by accident, really. And then it turned out there was a lot to write about. And so that's where I stayed.
And the late 90s was also historically, obviously, a very, very interesting time in Russia.
Yeah, it was. Actually, I moved to Russia about 10 days after Vladimir Putin became prime minister, which I didn't realise at the time, obviously. I mean, no one did. Was a really historic moment. So I've actually never been to Russia when he hasn't been in charge, which is pretty amazing since I've been going. I lived there for ages, and been going backwards and forwards for more than 20 years, and yet he's been in charge for that entire period, which is pretty extraordinary. It's been a time of pretty dramatic transformation. So yeah, it's been a super interesting time to be there, and it was a very fortunate decision for me to decide to move there.
I would think so. Well, we have something in common there because I keep studying Russia as well and their rich history. And I always say whenever we celebrate our liberations, I say, don't just thank the Americans, thank the Russians too. But back to your book, Moneyland. The book Moneyland, for the listeners, is very much about all the things Oliver just spoke about. It is about the hyper-rich who live in a country that they create themselves. That's, I think, I'm going to ask you about this. It's a country, it's not a country, it's not a legal jurisdiction. I always combine it by saying it's the land where the rich live, consume, but don't contribute. And so you called that country Moneyland. How did you actually come up with that word?
It was because I was in Ukraine following the revolution in 2014, and obviously the president had fled. Many of his friends had fled, but all of their palaces and various luxury properties had been left behind. So I'd been exploring quite a lot of these properties just because it was interesting and kind of funny. And one day I happened to remark to a friend of mine, Anton, that I found it extraordinary that the Ukrainians had allowed their presidents to be so corrupt. How I think I said, how did you let him get away with it? At which point he got a little bit angry with me and pointed out that that they hadn't known that he had so much property, because all the property was, as the way he put it, the property was in England, by which he meant that it was owned via English shell companies, which it all was. And so I sort of researched that. I didn't know anything about corruption. I mean, I'd been targeted by police officers on the street, but I didn't know anything about how corruption works and how money laundering works. It was all totally closed to me. So I went and researched that and found it absolutely extraordinary that Britain, supposedly a civilized rule of law jurisdiction, should be being used in this way. I mean, I was very naive. It was all remarkable. And but it occurred to me that it wasn't right to say that the palaces were in England, as he said they were, because they're obviously not. They're in Ukraine. You can visit them, but they're not in Ukraine either. So if they're not in Ukraine and they're not in England, then where are they? And I said to myself, just as a joke, well, they're in Moneyland. It was just my little joke to myself. But then the more I studied corruption and the more I came to understand it, the more I realised that actually the concept of Moneyland as a kind of legal country which is only accessible to people who can afford the entrance fee is actually a really useful concept to explain why it's so hard to tackle financial crime and the beneficiaries of financial crime. Why once money has been stolen and put in Moneyland, in inverted commas, it's so hard to find it again, because it's essentially protected by what is, to all intents and purposes, a separate country. And I just found it a very useful metaphor just for myself. It wasn't one I shared with anyone at all. It was just to help me understand what was happening. And then I was talking to my wife, who's and I was talking about corruption, and I said I like to think of it as a separate country called Moneyland, and she found it really helpful. I thought, well, if she finds it helpful, maybe other people will find it helpful, and started using it with other people. And then lo and behold, I thought, well, why not? It's probably quite a good title for a book. So
Absolutely.
There we go. But it wasn't a deliberate. Very few things I do ever are deliberate. To be honest, it was an entirely accidental process, and it was something that started out because it was helpful to me, and then I think it turned out to be quite helpful to other people as well.
Yeah. And what's interesting is it's so well defined, sort of the contradictions, because on the one hand, it is a country without borders, and on the other hand, it has a huge wall around it that protects the people who are in it and makes it inaccessible to others. So, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you, having read the book, it's very obvious, that the kleptocrats, they steal, they evade, they spend. The effect is clear that it has on the economy. Well, I say it's clear, it's very obvious, but it's probably badly understood. The cause is greed. The solution is very hard. And that's what I want to say. Like, if you were in an ideal position, what could you possibly do about it? Because on the one hand, there's globalization. We have national laws that protect people. What would you see as a possible solution in an ideal world?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that question. One is about enforcing laws that we already have. We have plenty of laws against money laundering already, plenty of laws against all aspects of financial crime, but we just don't enforce them. We are, particularly in Europe, by which I'm still including the UK, we are extremely bad at enforcing laws against financial crime. And only a fraction of a percentage of the money that gets stolen every year is ever recovered. That's whether that money is stolen by kleptocrats or by fraudsters or financial criminals of all kinds. So that's part of it. But another part is about whether we need new laws. And I think that the key problem is about the lack of financial transparency, or the lack of transparency of ownership of property. We have got into this curious situation where companies, limited companies, which were never intended to be used for this purpose, are used essentially to facilitate identity fraud. You can pretend to be an investor, a legitimate investor, when you're not, just by owning your property via a limited company. And it's so absurd if you think about what a limited company was designed to be used for. They were designed to encourage entrepreneurs by limiting the risk that they faced when investing in a new project. A limited company is a form of insurance in which your risk is covered by the rest of society. And the idea that can be anonymous, that you can essentially have an anonymous insurance policy is ridiculous. It's such an open invitation to fraud. And I find it, as soon as you explain that to anyone, they realise the absurdity inherent in an anonymous company. So we need to abolish anonymous companies, that they can't exist. And anonymous, not just companies, anonymous structures of all kinds, whether that's, limited partnerships or trusts or foundations, whatever, and anonymity needs to be, in almost all purposes, abolished. And I think that would make an absolute huge difference. If I talk to, people, friends who work in law enforcement, the months of work they have to put in just to figure out who owns a property is ridiculous. It shouldn't take more than 2 minutes to find out who owns a house. And once we've sorted that out, it will become much easier to enforce the laws. I'm not saying we don't need new laws, but we already have plenty of good laws. So we need to start enforcing them, and I think that would go a long way. And I'm quite.
But that needs to be internationally, right? I mean, because if you have a law in the UK, laws are national, right? So the problem is international. That's what I got out of your book, right? So you can enforce a law.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely, the problem is international. But saying the problem is international is just a description. It isn't a way of diagnosing the problem, because if you say, well, because the problem is international, we need to wait for international action, you're essentially giving Panama a veto over all international policy against money laundering, which is a real problem, let alone giving the United States a veto, which is also a problem. I think in the Netherlands and in the UK, we're in strong positions because both of our countries are big international financial centres, that we have a significant influence over international money flows. And that gives us a disproportionate influence over the way the world economy works. So I think it's got to the point where it's foolish to wait now.
Yeah.
But actually,
the countries you mentioned are part of the problem, right? I mean, if I look at in the Netherlands and if I look at Switzerland, modern democracies, even Delaware in the US, for example, are part of the problem. Correct?
Absolutely. One thing I think about this sometimes, if you compare sort of previous scourges of humanity, kleptocracy is a massive. It is behind many of the most important and pressing problems facing humanity now, whether that's inequality and terrorism and everything. But this kleptocracy makes it all worse. If you look at a previous scourge of humanity, one which has been in the headlines recently, say the scourge of slavery, when Britain, Britain, which had previously been the primary slave trading nation in the world, decided that it was no longer going to participate in it and move to abolish the slave trade. We didn't wait for anyone else to come and help. You just went and did it. If it's the best time to do the right thing is right now. So, the right thing is to abolish kleptocracy. So you shouldn't wait for other people to come and do that for you. You should do it because it's the right thing. If you're not, and so I think it's, if the argument is that it will be ineffective to act unilaterally, well, I disagree. That's just if you reduce the amount of space for kleptocratic cash to move in, that is an effective response. If the argument is that we are essentially missing out on the trade if we unilaterally withdraw from it, then it's still the right thing to do because we shouldn't be involved in this trade anyway. So I think from a practical and a moral standpoint, there's no argument for delay. The time to act is now.
So I sensed at the beginning already that you were, you said, at least you made a remark like nothing's changing, right? After your investigations, also your colleague. Maybe a very straight Dutch kind of question, but, is there maybe not a political willingness to change this? Or what is your view on that?
There definitely isn't. I'm working on a new book at the moment, and one of the stories I'm looking to tell in this new book is this curious and slightly niche story of what's called the Scottish Limited Partnership. And the Scottish Limited Partnership is a particular kind of corporate structure which was essentially only really used to facilitate agricultural tenancies in Scotland for 100 years. And then it was discovered by Eastern European money launderers and became the vehicle of choice for moving money particularly via bank accounts in the Baltic states. In thousands upon thousands of them were created, having previously been, only a few hundred of them over 100 years. the Danske Bank fraud, the Moldova bank fraud, huge, all the laundromats, it's always Scottish limited partnerships. They're a gigantic problem. They were identified in 2015. It would be unbelievably simple to solve the problem. It would be, the tiniest piece of legislation, the problem would be solved. But there is a concern in the UK that if we bring in extra regulations on limited partnerships, then the fund industry will leave the UK and go to Luxembourg. And therefore, nothing has happened. And essentially the argument is, well, OK, so 250 billion euros got stolen from the former Soviet Union, laundered via Danske Bank and ended up God knows where. But we can't have the fund industry go to Luxembourg. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's no political will, because the people who all that money is stolen from, whether that's in Ukraine or Russia or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, the people that money is stolen from, they don't get to vote in the UK. And I see the same dynamic happening in the Netherlands and in Spain and in other countries which have been, big sort of centres in Lisbon as well, centres for kleptocratic cash, let alone in the United States. You try and say to politicians in Nevada that they have to restrict regulations around shell companies. They say, well, where's the money going to come from? How are we going to fund our roads and so on? And it's a real challenge.
You're giving me a bridge here, because Brian and I discuss this topic very often, and you said, in Holland, absolutely right, is there political willingness? We've had this debate forever where they said, well, if we become tighter on, the whole thing with trusts, etc., the business will move elsewhere, or connected to the trust is a lot of, legal services that we then miss, and all of this humbug. True as it might be, same as with slave trade, if something is just not right, you should just not do it, because you will, if you stop one thing, you will open up another source of decent income and revenue. Talking about political willingness, though, I can see our politicians now literally already sweating on television when the topic comes up, because they know that the people have had it up to here. We know that we're going to pay for all the rescue packages from the corona crisis, etc. And people are really, really upset that it's always the sort of mid-range of the economy that pays, and that we're sick and tired of trusts and kleptocrats getting away with stuff. What is your take then on today's situation? Because I think that the willingness, particularly with the voters, increases to do something about it. On the other hand, I've just come back from a presentation at the Dutch Business Radio, and we already see that the people who are incredibly rich are using this crisis to make themselves even richer, because they're buying up property in San Francisco at reduced prices. What is your take on the current sort of time zone sentiment we're in, and what will the impact be on willingness to do something about it or on events happening?
It's a really interesting question. We saw exactly the same dynamic after the financial crisis in 2007 to 8, when governments responded to it by opening new loopholes for the super rich to try and attract them to their economies, to support their economies and bring in money. So many countries, notably Malta, Cyprus and Portugal started making a lot of money out of selling visas and passports, but not only them, other people doing it as well. The United States got very heavily involved in this trade too. So it is a very difficult thing to resist when there's a crisis. If a lawyer for wealthy people comes to you and says, well, if you just tweak this law and change this, then all of my clients will move to your country and that will be lots of money for your top end restaurants and so on. It's a difficult thing to resist. But I also think that there is also a moment of opportunity as well. I think that this public anger over people who cheat, who break the rules, and who freeload on civilization. I think this public anger, which we saw after the last financial crisis, that we're seeing to a certain extent today as well. This can be mobilised as a way for driving change, to force other countries to do the right thing. So I don't know. I don't think that the decision is made. I think that this is still hanging in the balance. It could go either way. Maybe this will be the opportunity, as it was after World War II, for a new and fairer system to be built for a while. I certainly hope so. I'm an optimist. I think that it's possible that the right thing will end up being done. That's what I hope, anyway.
All right. Hey, Oliver, this is a lot of our listeners are fintech enthusiastic people or from the financial services sector. And I understand now that transparency of ownership of assets is, a key to a solution, right? And basically we need to understand who owns what. Now, nowadays we have data on everyone and everything, right? So if we could combine that with legislation, would that be maybe a possible direction for a solution if we use tech?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I'm not. Tech is just a tool. It can be used for good or bad, like any tool. It's about making sure that the right regulation is built up around it, and it's pointing in the right direction. I mean, I think that what we need to make sure is that anonymity is provided for people who deserve it. So if someone has genuine fear for their safety, whether from if someone is a wife who has fled an abusive marriage and has a genuine fear for her safety, she needs to be sure of her anonymity, and anyone who needs it should be able to receive it. But at the moment, we have a system whereby you gain anonymity if you can afford it, not if you deserve it. So if we could legislate for anonymity, then otherwise you could have a default of transparency, and I think that would make it very straightforward. I mean, I'm nervous of saying that tech is the solution because I don't see that it's anything other than a sophisticated publishing platform.
Sure,
it could help with the resources problem immensely, obviously.
And crawl down. I mean, all those LTDs, all those shell companies. I mean, they use 10, 15 maybe, right, to come to the ultimate beneficiary owner. I mean, to crawl back on all those companies, right? You can use bots and technology.
Exactly. Well, just look at the problems banks have with regular KYC on business customers, where they have to do that in a positive sort of way, find out who's behind all the documents. It's a very tough thing to do. But you were touching on something, the transparency, and that if you're threatened, you should be entitled to this. I can also imagine that not everybody was a happy reader of your book. Have you ever been feeling unhappy or unsafe throughout your work?
I mean, I used to, before I wrote about financial crime, I was briefly a war reporter. So I felt, I felt quite unsafe doing that. It's different. It's not really comparable. I get threatening letters from lawyers telling me that I've defaming someone, and if I continue to write about them, I'll be taken to court. So that's annoying. But it's not. I haven't felt a physical threat. I mean, I'm a firm believer in not really worrying about things that you can't change. Well,
here's another one. Yeah, I mean, very important.
There's nothing. I mean, if people get cross about what I write, then there's nothing I can do about that, really. No. So I just carry on.
I think that's a very fair stance. Now, besides your obviously, this writing about money laundering has taken your whole life in a particular direction. Is money laundering, financial fraud, is that going to be the cause that you focus into? Because there are many, many ways that are not right in this world. And is this going to be sort of a topic that you continue to explore? Or you talked about a next book. Are you going to tap into some other inequality issues? What is the big silver thread?
The next book I write will also be about financial crime, about regulatory capture, but with a very specific UK focus. After that, I'm quite keen to keep working on international kleptocratic financial flows. I have a long-term goal of becoming very famous, so I can pitch my agent a book about rugby. And I will be so famous that people will buy it. That's my aim. Because what I'd really like to do is write a book about rugby.
Are you a rugby player yourself?
No, I'm not. But I'm from Wales and we love rugby here. So I would like to travel the world watching rugby and find But I think, for example, if you were as famous as J.K. Rowling, you could write a book about anything and people would buy it.
She can write a cookery book and we'll buy it.
Well, I mean, I don't think. I mean, I think it's just a question of having, being the kind of person that if your name is on the front of a book, people would just buy it anyway. That's the aim. So in the long term, I would like to become so famous that I could write a book about rugby and people would read it. But yeah, in the meantime, I'm going to write about financial crime because there's the astonishing thing about financial crime is it's like pulling on a bit of string that just never ends. There's just so much of it out there that you start off and think, well, this is going to be easy to investigate, and then you turn a corner and suddenly it's like you've entered this new labyrinth which just goes on and on and on and keeps multiplying. There are so many iterations and it's developing so fast and it's so sophisticated and the law enforcement agencies are so out-resourced that it just seems astonishing that everyone doesn't write about it. It seems so interesting to me that I don't understand why everyone isn't fascinated by it, because it's
So are you doing any other things and besides writing books to tackle to stay in the rugby terms to tackle this issue or problem? I mean, do you besides podcasts, of course? I mean, what else are you doing?
Well, at the moment I'm not, because my primary activity at the moment is homeschooling my children, because schools are still shut here. But I'm with various friends, we put on events to try and bring people together and to I'm a firm believer that we look at financial crime in silos. We look at kleptocracy like one thing, we look at fraud like one thing, we look at them all separately, but they're all one phenomenon and they're all related. So I try and do that, and we run these events called kleptocracy tours in London when we put people on the bus.
Yeah, I found you on YouTube.
Yeah, so we're not doing them at the moment, obviously, but they're quite fun. It's just a question of trying to interest people in kleptocracy and financial crime in whatever way is obvious, and possible. And there's a long way to go. Kleptocracy is not yet the new rock and roll, but I'm working on it. And I think that...
You're working on it. And thank you very much. And just to wrap it up again, because I do think that a lot of people are interested in it, because you write as if you read your books as if you're in the story. It reads like a thriller. So that's very important. The style will engage a lot of people. But secondly, also, one part of the population is intrigued by the ridiculous wealth, and the other one is intrigued by the crime. So I think you are tapping into two worlds here. And thank you so very much for today. I hope that we can help you achieve your goal, that we cut this line to your rugby book by a little bit, and we're going to do our damnedest with the promotion of the podcast. So thank you so very, very much, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
Well, thank you.
We're looking forward to hearing about the new book.
My only concern is I did get a message on Twitter the other day from someone who said they'd read my book and it had given them lots of ideas, which made me a bit worried. So please don't, if you do read the book, don't read of it as a how-to guide. It's supposed to be more of a warning how not to. It's not designed to give you a guide to how to steal money.
Put a warning on the next cover, but rest assured we're looking forward to your next cover. Thank you, Oliver Bullough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You've done too much too young. Now you're married with a kid when you could be having fun with me. Oh no, not doing no more big thing.
For people wanting to lecture themselves and others on illicit money flows, I would suggest to follow Oliver Bullough closely.
Are you curious for the music weekend favorites of Oliver Bullough? Check them out on www.fintechcappuccino.com/Oliver Bullough. Oliver, thank you for joining us here at the virtual kitchen table in the Fintech Cappuccino podcast. And thank you for listening to Fintech Cappuccino. Don't want to miss another cup? Subscribe to our podcast via Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. And please give us a like, a review. so many more Fintech Cappuccino lovers can find us then.
And please join us again on Saturday mornings at 9. We'll have the coffee ready just the way you like it. Have a good weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. Keep a distance and stay close to each other. Be safe.